So now let's implement the geolocation service. Over in Services, I'm going to generate a new class that I'm just going to call Chord Service for now. And this class is going to need the ability to log errors, so I'll go ahead and just use a constructor and a logger. Let's bring in the logging namespace as well. Then we can start talking about how to actually implement this as a service. So we're going to want a public method here that returns a data structure. In our case, we're going to create one that's going to be called Chord Service Result. It'll be what the service is going to return that will give us information about either a successful or a failed lookup of coordinates. And I'll just call it lookup, and I'll give it the name of a location. So this isn't going to know about the database, the data structures, any of that. We're going to pass it in a location. It's going to attempt to look it up and then return the result. So let's implement this result type in a new class. And like I mentioned earlier, Visual Studio 2015 is putting in the wrong place. So I'm going to drag it back up to services where it belongs. And let's implement it. The first thing we're going to want is a property for whether it succeeded or not. We're also going to want a couple of properties for the actual coordinates. Latitude, and let's go ahead and add a final one for some message that we want to communicate back. So that's pretty simple. Let's create a new instance of the service result with some default failure conditions. Success equals false, message equals undetermined failure while looking up coordinates, right? Just some simple message. And then here at the bottom, we'll return that result, and hopefully we'll actually look up the right results. Look up coordinates. So how do we want to actually look up those coordinates? For our use, I'm going to use the Bing Map service to go and look up these coordinates. Now you could use any service you want. That's not really crucial to how we're implementing this, but I think you'll see there's some lessons to be learned. For the Bing service, we're going to need an URL to that service. And this is, the URL to the Bing Map service is still the virtualearth.net address. This is a URL that you can get when you register with the Bing Maps APIs as one of the APIs they expose for looking up names. And so the couple of things we need here is the query string includes an encoded version of the name. So let's encode that. Encoded name equals web utility is the tool we're going to use to do it, and it's in system.net. And we're just going to URL encode the location. This is the Miami, Florida, or whatever the users end up putting in for the location. The second thing we're going to need, if we look at the end of the URL, is actually a key. This is a magic Bing key that Bing supports so that it knows that you are the one making this request. And after a large number of requests, you might get billed, but for this sort of application or something in the enterprise, you're probably never going to reach those limits anyway. To get your own Bing key, you can go to the Microsoft.com address of maps, create a Bing map key.aspx. Yeah, that's really the address. And this will allow you to go ahead and create a simple key, tells you what the limits are, it takes about 3 minutes to set this up, and you'll get a magic string that's available. So we'll go ahead and use the configuration like we have with other things, and I'll put this in app settings Bing key, right? So since we're getting it from configuration, you might be tempted to put it in your configuration file. We could certainly go ahead and put a Bing key here, but I don't want you to hard code your keys in configuration files. These files tend to go into source control, other people can look at them, you end up leaking this information through ways that you're not expected to. Well, if I'm getting it from configuration, where else am I going to put it? And that's sort of the magic of configuration. Let's go back to the startup.cs and let's talk about that. When we built the configuration object, we told it to read from two places. A JSON file that you saw we just added to, and also to add environment variables. And in fact, there's other types of places you can add to the configuration, like an INI file, or even something called user secrets. In our case, environment variables actually gives us the opportunity for me as a user to insert my key secretly just as an environment variable. And you could imagine doing this on a server without it having to necessarily go into the configuration file, something that's checked in a physical file to get it at the machine instead of being protected by the OS. The environmental variables we're talking about here are cross-platform. So we're talking about environment variables within Windows or Linux or OS X. So if we open up our system properties, and I'm using Windows 10 here, there's an environmental variables button that's going to pop up and show us what environment variables we're using. And so I can actually just create a new one, and it'll take the whole name that we're using as the key, and here I can actually paste in my Bing key. Of course, I don't want you to see it, so I'm not going to finish pasting it here until I pause and close this window. So I've created the environment variable. Let's go ahead and use this new service so we can debug it and I can show you where it's pulling this data. In order for me to use this service, I'm going to need to register it in Startup first. So let's come down here and add services.add_scoped. So that it's once per request cycle instead of just every time it's requested, and the chord service. So I'm adding it as something that can be injected, therefore here in my stop controller, I'll add it as another constructor parameter. And then I'll add it to the class so we can use it, and then finally here, and looking up coordinates, I can just do the work of chord service, lookup, and pass in the new stop.name, right? That's what we're going to actually look for. And if chord result success isn't true, then we can do the same thing we were doing. Status code equals bad request. And this time we'll return chord result.message as the information back to the user about why this is failing. Otherwise, we can go ahead and just use the new coordinates, new stop.longitude equals chord result.longitude, new stop.latitude equals chord result.latitude. So let's set a breakpoint in our chord service so we can see how this Bing key is coming through before we finish implementing the service itself. Let's run the project and go over to Postman and try to insert our new stop. They were asking for the Bing key, and what we're getting is the Bing key that is included in the configuration file that I added, more to show you what's happening. Now you might be wondering why we're not getting this from the environment variables. The reason is that we haven't restarted Visual Studio. Visual Studio is running in a process that read the environment variables on startup, like all processes do. And because they changed this without restarting Visual Studio, it doesn't have access to that new key I added. So let's just restart Visual Studio. I'll just do a whoo and pause it while I do that. One moment. Now we're back and restarted. Let's run it again. Execute it in Postman, stop, and when we get the Bing key, we're going to get the value from the environment variable. Now you can't really tell that I got it from the environment variable because I have blurred it so I don't let someone steal my key, but you'll have to trust me, we're getting it from the environment variable now, and so we can continue to actually make this work. So now that we're getting the good Bing key and we're building the URL the way we need it to, and we've already wired up to use this service, let's actually make the request out to the Bing service. Let's do that next.